Greetings, friends, family, strangers, and enemies of all kinds. I did that out of order, but such is the way of life, this sweet life, some might say. Welcome back to the Extra Milestone, your weekly Cinemaholic spinoff, where we go back in time to discuss the classic films that have impacted the cinematic landscape violently and shaped it into what it is today. This is where we go back and look at those films. I am your host, as always, Sam Noland. I'm a staff writer for Cinemaholics, and with me, I have one of my very best friends in this entire world, the host of the Cinemaholics main show, and just all-around swell guy. It is my friend and your friend, I hope, John Negroni. John, welcome back.
You know, in honor of the movie we're talking about, I'm going to mimic what you said earlier and say, hello, vagabonds, clowns, paparazzi, and debutantes.
Of all kinds. Yes.
Of all kinds, including Swedish actresses.
Including especially Swedish actresses.
And not limited to.
And not limited to, indeed. Yes, this is the Extra Milestone. And on this very episode that you're listening to right now, John, the time has come. Back in February, we were doing it a little bit differently where we had like a poll. Do you remember this? It seems like so long ago. For the month of February, we ultimately did Pinocchio, but one of the other movies on that list to talk about was Federico Fellini's La Dolce Vita.
Oh, yes.
And it lost to Pinocchio.
Somehow.
And you were very upset about that. Yes, to this day, it's a mystery as to how Pinocchio
Legend has it was a landslide, but I maintain it was rigged.
It was a landslide, and it may have been rigged. There's no reason it can't have been both. But yes, Pinocchio won by a lot. La Dolce Vita, I don't think got a single vote except by John, which does not matter as much as you might think. Yeah. And but yeah, the thing with the Extra Milestone is that sometimes we don't necessarily fudge the release dates, but we sort of were flexible with it. So, for instance,
we pick
a lot
and
of movies,
the release dates we want to go with.
Yeah. So and it actually makes things a lot easier. There's not just one opportunity to talk about one film or another. Sometimes we get multiple chances. Sometimes there is only one release date. A lot of movies are like that, where it just releases wide and that's that. But a lot of movies are released at festivals. They're released at different times in multiple countries. And La Dolce Vita is one of them. It was released in Italy in February of 1960, but it premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in France in May of 1960, which is when it's held every year. As a result, a lot of big prestige art house classics are actually eligible for the month of May. Julia Tatey and I just got to talk about one last week with Jan Dielman. And so we're doing it again. 2 weeks
should say
in a row.
This is the film that won the Palme d'Or that year in 1960.
Yes,
we also could have gone with April, because it started showing in theaters in the United States around that time. So
yeah, it's got a long, complex release date history, but that's not important. What's important is that we're finally talking about. John, how does it feel to finally be getting your wish?
Yeah, I should be upfront with the listeners that this is one of my all-time favorite movies. This is my favorite movie we've talked about on Extra Milestone to date. No kidding. It's like above Seven Samurai and Some Like It Hot, which are
statement.
Yes, I do like this movie more than Seven Samurai.
Okay.
Just barely. In fact,
fair enough.
After rewatching it for this, I decided, you know what, enough is enough. It's been in my top 10 for a long time. I moved it into the top 5. It happened.
Ooh.
Breakfast at Tiffany's took a hit. I'm sorry, the Mickey Rooney thing has been bugging me too much. And I had to do it. I had to push La Dolce Vita to my number 5 movie of all time. So there it is.
That's fascinating. So you watched it just within the last couple of days, I take it.
I've seen it twice in the last 4 months. So I rewatched it in February because I saw the writing on the wall. I knew I knew Pinocchio was going to win, but I was like, who cares? I'm rewatching Dolce Vita.
Yeah, no reason why not.
It again.
Cool.
Yeah.
So you've seen it twice in the past 4 months. What is this like total? Is it like a dozen or 2 dozen or something like that?
No, this is 4 or 5 times total.
Okay.
In the last 6 years.
6 years. That's a long history. That's a lot of time to reflect on it. I myself only just watched it several months ago, just because I decided I'm going to watch just all the movies eligible for February. We had like this really long period where we kept trying to do the episode and it kept not working out. And I was like, with all this extra time, I'm going to watch literally everything. And that happened to be one of them. So I checked it out and then I saw it again just last night. John, I want to know what was the first time that you saw it? Like, what was the context and what was sort of your reaction at the time?
Yeah, I had a phase where I was living in California for the first time, and I was starting to get into the Criterion films a little bit more. I think it was not too long after the first time I went to the Alamo Drafthouse, and I was going through Fellini's Videodrome rentals and all of that, and I was like, oh man, or I said Videodrome, it's Video Vortex.
Videodrome.
I have
there's
I
a
have James
VHS
Woods on the brain.
slot in James Woods' torso. Yes.
Yep. But yeah, so I was looking through those, and that's always fun, of course, because I really enjoy going through those director filmographies. But yeah, I was looking through it and I found La Dolce Vita, and I was like, oh, okay, this is something that I want to see. I had heard about it. I had already seen 8.5, which a lot of people say, no, that's the best Fellini movie. That's the one that is his most autobiographical. It's his follow-up.
Autobiographical, eh?
Yeah. Is that your Italian accent?
I don't know what that was. Let's move on.
Regardless. Yeah. And so I saw it and I was like, oh, okay, 3 hours. That's fine. I can do that. I can watch 3 hours. And I fell in love. This movie blasted me into like another time zone when I watched it the first time, specifically the Trevi Fountain, which we'll talk about. I'm haunted by that scene. Like, that is the main reason I rewatched the movie, is to watch every second of that scene, starting with Anita Ekberg wandering the streets of Italy, the streets of Rome, late at night in 1960. And my gosh, does a movie hold up the way this movie holds up? Sam, I'm curious, like, can you believe that this was shot then? Like, it's so crisp, it's so fresh, it's just unbelievable. And I don't know how you watched it, but most of the times I've rewatched it have been through like DVDs or rentals.
Yeah.
But recently, the only way to watch it is through the Film Box, which is a channel on Prime Video. But yeah, how did you see it?
That is exactly that. A few months ago when I was going to watch it, I was like, okay, where is it? Turns out it's almost nowhere. Like, it's not like all these other classics that are available on a litany of streaming services. It's relatively easy to find. This one is only on Amazon Prime. And get this, it's expiring in like 2 weeks. What do you want
Very
from
sad.
us, La Dolce Vita? Yeah. So besides purchasing the Criterion Blu-ray, which I take it you possess that, is that correct?
No, but I was looking at that this morning. I was like, I should probably just do this, because the way I've been doing it is I just get it through the library. And because this is one of my favorites, I should just own it.
It's funny that you mentioned the rentals at the Draft House. I went with you to that very Alamo Draft House and saw they have like this miniature video store up front. And one of them, I was leafing through the titles and I get to the L section, and one of them I saw was La Dolce Vita. Do you remember this? I saw it and was like, oh, I've never actually seen this one. And you were like, Sam, you heathen. How could you?
Was it La Dolce Vita? I thought it was a different Fellini film, but maybe I misremembering.
No. It was, I remember very specifically it was that one, because you said exactly what you said earlier in this episode, which is that is one of the greatest movies of all time. And then here we are a little over a year later. And then we saw Godzilla King of the Monsters later that night. And then you fell asleep during it.
Yeah. Can you imagine?
That was a fun time.
I wish we could have seen like a classic movie on that screen.
My.
That would have been fantastic. I to this day, somebody who loves me will hopefully take me to a screening of La Dolce Vita on the big screen. That would be like the greatest gift of all time.
You know, I don't know what the situation out there in the Bay Area is, and this is a bit of a tangent, but in my area, a variety of theaters are doing like private screenings where you can select a movie if you have like a DVD or a digital copy or something. And I think it depends on the theater, but up to like 5 or 10 friends can have an entire auditorium all to yourself, and then they like sanitize it in between everyone going in and stuff. And so that's something I've been strongly considering, but it doesn't seem like
First, we got to find 5 or 10 friends.
I got to find at least 4 other friends. Yeah. And it just doesn't seem like the right environment to do it with like all this, tension in the atmosphere and stuff. I'd be too busy. I'd be too concerned about the workers of the theater, working at a theater myself. But regardless, that could be interesting, just seeing it in a theater completely alone. I'd be very curious to.
I want to see it with a crowd.
I want to see anything with a crowd, anything to get back into the theater.
Sam, it sounds to me like what you're looking for is the sweet life.
I'm looking for the sweet life, or as they say in Mother Italy, I'm looking for La Dolce Vita, which is the movie
coincidence
that we're talking about this week. John, I want you to let the listeners know in as few or as many sentences as you can, if they haven't seen it, or if it's been a long time, or even if they have and just want a refresher. What's like the gist of La Dolce Vita? If you had to summarize it, if you had to pitch it to someone, how would you describe it?
Yeah, like what are you in for? Yeah. Well, you're in for about a 3-hour movie, first of all. So just accept that. It's about 180 minutes or so.
Yeah, I think it's like 253 or something like that.
You're going to get a series of almost episodic misadventures featuring a gossip journalist who lives in Rome, and he lives what people outside of his life might perceive as a decadent lifestyle. And he goes through a lot of nights and mornings descending into these dark and sort of like morally bankrupt areas and nightclubs and situations involving prostitutes, where you see him sort of questioning the weird tension between humanism, like human hedonism, and religion. This is a man who sees the appeal of religion, but he also sees the hypocrisy of Italian post-World War II culture, sort of looking at morality and religion as a cudgel or some sort of alien foreign thing that exists in the background. This is a movie that opens with literally a statue of Jesus Christ being flown over Rome, the capital of the Catholic Church, to the St. Peter's Cathedral. But not only that, but you have the helicopter right behind it trying to make a spectacle of it. And there's a ton of scenes that are about the spectacle we make of religion and how people don't really apply the lessons and the morality and the dogma of religion to themselves. And so you're watching that entire thematic, dense narrative through this lonely, desperate, kind of pathetic man who lives his life trying to learn from other people, but then ultimately being let down by everyone. And he can see this sort of purity. He can see this sort of lifestyle just out of reach. But what gets in the way is his sin and the 7 sins, the 7 hills of Rome and whatnot, and how that keeps him from any sort of self-actualization. He just idealizes everything. And it's hard because you're going to watch this movie and you're probably going to look at this guy and be like, he's terrible. He is. He's toxic. He cheats. He has no sort of like sense of self. But that's really the point of this movie. And you're going to be getting one of what I consider the best breakdowns, one of the best movies talking about the relationship between man and God. It's like the painting of God and Adam, like kind of personified through an Italian post-neorealism film. And I would also say, if you're a fan of Fellini, you're also going to be getting what I think is like his midpoint film. This is like right in the middle of his earlier work, which was more of the Italian neorealism stuff like La Strada and, films like Bicycle Thieves, which I know you're a big fan of, Sam. That's the more grounded Italian cinema. And then post La Dolce Vita, that's when you start getting Fellini, when he goes super abstract. He gets extremely absurd and decadent. And this movie is like a beautiful combination of the two. If I had to metaphor it a bit, I don't know if there's a verb for metaphoring, but it's literally like coffee itself. Like the bitter coffee is the neorealism, and the milk, the sweet milk, the dolce, the sugar, all of that. It's like blended together into one drink. And that represents the rest of his career.
I could not have said it better myself. I hadn't thought of that in terms of the larger context of Fellini's career, because the movie he made, if not right after this, then very shortly after this, was 8.5, which is extremely abstract. Touches on a lot of the similar themes from what I remember of sort of that hedonistic lifestyle and show business, specifically as it relates to like the Italian culture and everything. I think melancholy is kind of the key word here, right? Or maybe just sort of bitter sweetness sort of permeating throughout this entire thing.
It's that sarcasm. Like the name of the film is sarcastic.
It's not, can be hard to pick up on, because the first time I was not really keyed into that as much. One of the first shots, at the very least, that you mentioned earlier of the helicopter flying into Rome, I think really grabbed my attention right off the bat, specifically on the second viewing, because it takes place in Rome, which is a city that has been portrayed very interestingly across film history, especially in this first half or so of the 20th century, in my experience at least, where it's this beautiful city with all this culture and all this lavish, luxurious happenings and goings on and stuff. And we see a lot of that in this movie, a lot of extravagant parties and things of that nature. But also it's a city just populated by ruins and remnants of the old world. Again, you mentioned the Catholic Church, how that still permeates very heavily throughout the city. And so it's very much this hot and cold sort of impression that we get from this movie and others.
It's a paradox.
It's the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. And we see both of those in this movie and how they sort of clash with each other and don't really mix well. And we see that as a result in Marcello, I want to say it right, Marcello Mastroianni. Is that right?
Yeah, Marcello Mastroianni.
Mastroianni's character, who also named Marcello, coincidentally enough. So, John, I want to get into some specifics here. What is maybe of the episodes of this movie? What's one that sort of stands out to you in particular when thinking about it in hindsight or while watching the movie or what have you?
Well, there's two, and I think the first one I already mentioned. It's the most iconic episode, and that is when Anita Ekberg's character shows up. So she is a Swedish actress. And from the very beginning of that scene, you're introduced this character, Sylvia, and she is like this flashy, just absurdly beautiful woman. And it begins with this like stage photo op and, her kind of being taken down into the canals of this society, and everybody wants a piece of her, but you see Marcello like lusting after her from afar, and it culminates in the Trevi Fountain scene, which is, it's the film's like central scene. And I think it's the scene that, if you're not sold on the movie already, I think that's when it's going to probably get you. And if it doesn't get you at that point, it probably won't ever, at least on the first viewing.
Marcello, where are you? Where did it go for that milk? My goodness. Marcello, come here. Hurry up.
Sì, Silvia, vengo anch'io. Ma sì, ha ragione lei, sto sbagliando tutto. Stiamo sbagliando tutto. Silvia.
Listen.
Silvia.
I mean, you can look at popular culture for the decades following, and the Trevi Fountain scene continues to just be such a piece of history, film history now. I think that's the major contribution that this film lends, is that scene, as well as the namesake of the paparazzi. It's a word that kind of, I think it means sparrow or bird or something. And this film sort of introduced that, not the idea of hounding photographers after like celebrity gossip culture, but specifically there's a character whose last name is Paparazzo. So now we have paparazzi. It's just something that's very, very influential that this film provides. The other scene though, because the Trevi Fountain one is a very obvious one. I think a lot of people would say that, but the other one that's always stood out to me, and it's so much more important than I think other people realize, is there is an episode that happens right after Marcello has just sort of been not lectured, but condescended to by somebody he looks up to, the character Steiner, who tells him, you got to write that book, you got to write that novel. And it sort of kicks Marcello into shape, and he's like, you know what, I'm going to do it. So in the next episode, we see him with his typewriter. He's out in the country, which was it's a metaphor for his roots, because we find out that's where he's from, is like the countryside, and it represents a more pure origin for him. And there is a scene where he sees this young girl who represents that side of him that was innocent, and that side of him that was able to think clearly about the world, but he's gotten so bogged down in like the moral hypocrisy of his time. That to me is Fellini at his most autobiographical at this in this movie, because he's telegraphing to the audience, like, this is how I'm feeling right now. And it's beautiful because he's able to criticize his lifestyle that he's experiencing right now in Italian high society without punching at it. He's recognizing simultaneously that he's part of it, and he can show that it is fun. Like, it's a fun life. It's a life that's full of short-term pleasures, and there are things about it that are not inherently bad. But as we see, it's a metaphor for how it descends. Like, the more and more Marcello gets caught up in this life, he descends into the worst version of himself. And it culminates in the closing scene. But I think that closing scene doesn't work for very obvious reasons without this middle one featuring the typewriter by the beach with this young country girl who shows up later. And it just absolutely floors me every time, especially when you rewatch it and you know what's about to happen. You know that what happens with Steiner is going to come about any second. So
that's fascinating. I hadn't thought about that. I believe the little vignette that you're describing, according to the little bit of research I did, is sort of viewed as like kind of the midpoint of the movie, where it doesn't necessarily fit in with any of the 7 distinct chapters that comprise the bulk of the plot of the movie. But it's sort of insubstantial, it's sort of incidental, but it does kind of unlock the entire character. So I think that's very fascinating that you say that. Now, I think it's what you just brought up with how this lifestyle has its setbacks, but also is very intensely rewarding. That's something that I found easier to latch onto on the second viewing, specifically in contrast with some of Fellini's other movies, which I gotta say, I have had trouble really digging Fellini stuff. I've seen, I think, like 4 or 5 by this point, including La Dolce Vita, and none of them have yet to completely blow me away. And I think part of that is because of that disconnect. We see these characters in La Dolce Vita and 8.5 specifically that are leading, is that the right word? Leading these incredibly lavish lifestyles. The regular average audience member watching that is just thinking to themselves, oh, you poor show business people, like with your problems that don't affect literally anyone else. It's easy to be rubbed the wrong way by that. I think specifically with 8.5, with the way it's kind of just a story about some older artist just sort of losing inspiration a little bit, just out of personal what's the word I'm looking for? Just sort of a feeling of impotence. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right.
That's right. Impotence.
The fact that this movie is about a journalist, someone who's very much on the fringes of that and gets to live in that world, but also is clearly like the other, you know what I'm saying? Like is not actually involved in all of it, just sort of gets to be there, just gets a little begrudging pass into it. And we see
the scraps.
We see Marcello interact with a lot of those artists, some poets, writers, actors, filmmakers, what have you. We see that getting to sort of get a little bit of a glimpse into that world while also not being able to fully indulge in it is kind of even the worst part. So it's actually easier to latch onto. I find it more approachable in that way. It's not about the strife that comes with luxury. It's sort of about just the way that it can infect those of us who do not get to live in that world. I'm curious, is that something that ever affected you in any sort of way in any of the viewings over the years? I was wondering how you approached that sort of aspect of the movie.
No, I think you are spot on about the experience that Marcello is like kind of languishing in this movie. That's why he wants to write a novel. For that exact reason, is because he feels like as a celebrity journalist, he's not creating anything. And he's constantly around people who are. And they seem like they're having fun. They seem like they're having the sweet life all around him. That's why he idolizes Steiner, because Steiner has this apartment that poets and folk singers and all these interesting people show up to. And he feels like, well, I can't do that. That's not me, because my life is empty, because I just report on what these celebrities are up to. And what I think people can latch on to, because you're right that, if it comes across as somebody complaining about, oh, woe is me, I have this really fun lifestyle, then I feel like audience members would, and some probably would read this into the film and say that, this is not for me. I can't connect with this character. But I think the real emotional through line here is this is almost sort of what it's like to lust after fame and lust after celebrity. And we spend so much of our time, a lot of us who feel any sort of ambition, wishing we had what other people have. And, I mentioned the 7 deadly sins. One of the main ones in this movie is envy. And that's a big reason why Marcello just can't seem to really understand why he feels like his life is incomplete. And you see him start to maybe get to that point that maybe he is making too much of celebrity culture when his dad shows up, and his dad is sort of like reveling in this lifestyle. And ultimately that impotence happens for him in a physical way. And I think that's when it starts to make Marcello realize what's going on. But then something happens in the film that I'll just say there's a reason he goes from being a celebrity journalist, which has like kind of a vein of objectivity of independent writing, to becoming just a publicist. And that's kind of what the film's getting at, I think, in that vein. And so, I think that is like, for people who might watch this and say like, this film's too much of its time. This is really just Fellini commenting on what life was like in 1960 Italy. It is, but I think it does match what's going on today. It's very relevant. It's very speaking to, like, whenever I get any sort of notifications or I see any sort of news story about this person is pregnant and this person is dating this person. And it's like, well, Dolce Vita already tore that idea new one 60 years ago. And yet, it's still such a prevailing force in society.
We see multiple times throughout the movie the way that I'll just call them the press, the paparazzi, whatever term you want to use, they're sort of always there. It's as if they're waiting at any second to just pounce on any inkling of a story, including multiple occasions where immediately following a tragedy, there's clearly a disdain for the press in this movie. I think that's very clear. I'm fascinated by all the stuff you've talked about so far. I want to know, we've mentioned a couple of the chapters, a couple of the events in the movie. I'm wondering, even if it's just to sort of revisit them and jog through the happy memories that you have of this movie, what's another chapter that you find yourself especially taken by that we haven't brought up yet?
I'd say the turning point that you just brought up, is worth evaluating, and specifically the way it starts. Like, it starts with Marcello having this really, really bad argument with Emma. So Emma is his partner who he constantly cheats on, and how he just sort of keeps her around because he feels like that's what he's supposed to do. And you see the battle within himself of like, should I marry this woman? Should I, be with her? And part of the reason he wants that is because he is envious of Steiner. He sees Steiner with like the perfect wife, the perfect kids, and he thinks that's my path to being happy. And as soon as he and Emma are finally reunited and they've gotten through this issue, he finds out the worst. He finds that Steiner has murdered his own children and himself. And it's the part of the film where Marcello completely loses faith. And what's so rewarding about rewatching this film so many times is you notice the little details. You notice how Fellini is not using music to tell you the emotion of the scene. He's using the filmmaking. He is avoiding close-up shots during that scene where the press swarm Steiner's wife, and she learns what happens to her family in the worst, most terrible way. It's so depressing. But you don't get a close-up of her face. You only see Marcello's reaction to what's going on. You only see the paparazzi making a spectacle of it. And there's all kinds of like little moments like that. Like the fact that Marcello he's always comparing himself to someone Fellini chooses two shots. There's so many two shots in this movie. Yeah, there really are. It's wonderful. It tells you what Marcello is thinking in a very restrained performance without beating you over the head with it.
I love that you brought up the cinematography and the way it just sort of doesn't try to do any work that the actual scenery and the actual dialogue and the writing and what have you doesn't do any of the work that stuff doesn't. It's very objective, if that's possible, for cinematography. I want to make sure I give credit cinematography by Otello Martelli. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that somewhat correctly. And yeah, it really just lets the scenery just sort of sing for itself, not even speak for itself, sing gorgeously for itself. I mentioned that it takes place in Rome earlier, and it really just shines in this movie. This is one of the best. There's certainly a subgenre of Rome movies, and this is certainly one of them. And this is one of the most pleasing, I think. You know, when you were mentioning Marcello's wife, Emma, it's the weirdest thing ever, and it has nothing to do with anything. But you know what character that almost reminded me, kind of? It's a completely different genre, a completely different set of circumstances, but I got this weird flashback of the protagonist's wife from Fahrenheit 451, with the way that she's sort of resigned to realizing that this man doesn't love her anymore. Right down to the first time we see her, he comes home and she's passed out. That's exactly what happens in Fahrenheit 451. I never put that together until right this minute. Who knows? Maybe Federico Fellini was a Ray Bradbury fan. We'll never know.
Well, that novel did come out right before they filmed the movie, so that would fit. Not right before even. I think it was 53. I want to say was when. Yeah, Fahrenheit so not even out. A decade. Relatively close in the grand scheme of things. But regardless, time is a construct. But that's a conversation for another time. So we've talked about a variety of events, a lot of the big ones. I think one of the, unless there was something else that you wanted to touch on, and by all means, the conclusion of this movie is really fascinating, and I would love to hear your take on that. Sure. Yeah, we've touched on most of it. We didn't get into one of the big ones in the very beginning, which is when we see Marcello have this weird sort of like affair with a celebrity in the basement of a prostitute. Yeah. And we also have a few different. Well, if I had to criticize like one aspect of the cinematography that maybe some people, I know, I'm not really criticizing it, but I'm saying that some people might say it's a little bit too on the nose. It's a little bit too tedious. It's the whole thing where he's going up and down stairs all the time. I mean, it's a little bit less subtle. It's fine.
It doesn't really bother me. Yeah, I think it's there's a place for a little bit more extravagant cinematography. I can't necessarily say this movie would be hurt by it. I think what we got is fine, photography wise.
He does a good job with it sometimes too. Like when he and Steiner go up into the loft of the church, it's a little bit less tedious. Like the movie doesn't give you enough time to sit and really think about it, so that it kind of hits you in a more subtle way. Mm-hmm. But yeah, getting into the ending, it's almost hard to watch, because it is like, it starts with a night sequence where Marcello is a little bit older, and there's this very strange like orgy that breaks out. And what I like about this scene is that it does feel like we're getting into Fellini's like later work. This is the part of the movie where it's becoming more and more off the rails, where you see characters like pushing their faces against the window, and like their faces are being like, you know, distorted. And that is like the Fellini that I think a lot of people know the filmmaker for. But it is something that, like, the mayhem of this scene and the deterioration of everything, it's a little hard to watch. It's a little bit like, man, how far has this guy fallen? And especially when he's going around and he's drunk and he's pathetic, and it goes on and it goes on. But then the dawn sequence, when you juxtapose the ending scene with the beginning scene, you literally begin the scene with like Jesus Christ in the sky over Rome, and then you end with like this monstrosity fish that some people say is like a kind of supposed to be a Leviathan sort of thing, but it looks like a stingray.
It's a big stingray that they pull out of the ocean with this net like it's nothing. Like that kind of made me laugh a little bit, how it almost seems like this cabal of just rambunctious youth that Marcello has fallen in with in the past couple of scenes. It's like just a thing that they do on a daily basis. Like that's kind of the vibe I get. I know they probably don't, but that gave you a little bit of enjoyment. And it's sort of Fellini leveling with us, almost as if to say like, yeah, this is who they are. They are this weird. Like there's no going back from this. All that stuff that happened the night before and pulling a stingray out of the ocean, they're unusual. And Marcello feels sort of out of place with
this. Is what they've earned. The movie starts with these people, this journalist chasing after Jesus, literally in a helicopter, not being able to keep up with it because they have to stop and have this weird miscommunication with a bunch of young women, and sin gets in the way, right? That's the religious allegory. And it ends with them out of the Bible. It's a fisherman thing. They fish out this monster, and that's what they get. Like that is what they get for this life. And it's still not over. Like Marcello still has a chance, because the young waitress from before is not too far away. It's just within reach, and all Marcello has to do is go to her and have this exchange. But he can't understand it, so he gives up. And what makes this scene perfect is the look on her face. She resigns to it. She's like, yeah, whatever. I don't care. And it's speaking to how Fellini looks at God, saying, you need me more than I need you. And it's a perversion. It's blasphemous, because the idea that God is love, the idea that God will love you and yearns for you, is being challenged here. But Fellini's sort of saying like that is sort of given humanity an out with their spiritual destinies, of always just assuming God's always going to be there, but not understanding that we need God so much more than we think God needs us. And it's about that hypocrisy of thinking that we're so important in the grand scheme of things. And it's a tough thing, because I think a lot of people who grow up very religious, like I did, look at this sort of thing and we feel a conflict, because we're taught to believe we're worth love. And in many ways we are. And I still believe that. But I do think what's valuable about this movie is that it challenges that in its most extreme direction, or its extreme consequence, is that we think we're so worth love that we can't handle it when reality challenges that in any sort of way. So this ending scene is perfect. It's complete bliss. At least if it gets you to rethink some of your preconceived notions of what makes us worth love without making you go into despair. I think it's dangerous for sure.
That is some really beautiful stuff that you just touched on. I think, yeah, I got nothing. I love all of that. Little tip of the cap to you, John, for that one.
I know some people are like, I love Extra Milestone because John goofs off. Not for this one.
No, not for this one. I can tell you have a deep connection with this movie, and I've loved getting to hear it over the course of this episode. I think I just want to touch on sort of how my experience with the movie might kind of compare to yours. Listener, as you can probably tell, I do not have nearly as nuanced of a perspective on this movie, if only as a function of time. It's only been several months since I first saw it. I do not have the growth with it that you have clearly had. And so I look forward to perhaps getting that growth. But also, if there's something that sort of held me back on the first viewing of La Dolce Vita as a whole, with across all of the chapters and vignettes and such, it's that I had trouble picking up on sort of the melancholy reflection of it all. I think it's my fault. I think I wasn't paying close enough attention to the very downplayed performance of Marcello Mastroianni, the way that we can just see him slowly resign himself to the idea that maybe this is all there is. Maybe it doesn't get better than this. Maybe some of us are just destined to not reach that same level that we see so many people reach. And we set these goals for ourselves and maybe they're not meant to be reached. But with the second viewing, I feel like I was definitely able to key into that a lot more, especially with that concluding scene that you just broke down so wonderfully. It is a deep movie. It's a layered movie. I cannot wait to explore it more. And I love everything that you've said, John. I thank you for letting me witness your wonderful interpretations of it. I'm curious, what did we miss? Is there anything else that you maybe wanted to touch on that we didn't? Of course, there's plenty to talk about, but for the purposes of this episode, I'm curious, what else is rattling around in that John noggin of yours?
Just a few more things. And honestly, I could talk about this movie all day. We didn't even get into so many other scenes. Like, this movie is just so dense. Like, we didn't get into like the whispering between the rooms. We didn't get into all of the Anita Ekberg stuff. And
we didn't get into Frankie Stout, which is a riot of a character.
Yeah. The whole clown thing, the trumpet and the balloon and all the stuff with his father. It is just something else, but we don't have all day. But yeah, a few less things that I do want to touch on. I do want to say, like, kind of in response to what you're kind of trying to figure out with the melancholy and Marcello and everything. It's difficult because his character kind of is hot and cold, to reference how you described the movie a little bit earlier, or how this movie views Italy and Rome.
Sure.
But that's kind of how Marcello is. He can be very passive and reactionary, very quiet until something triggers him, but then he can also be very aggressive.
Yeah, we see that in the ending sort of orgy scene. We see that side of him come out.
And I think the heart of this movie is just that we spend a lot of time trying to figure this guy out, but he's also trying to figure himself out. And that's it. That's the movie. And I think it only works because of that performance. I think Marcello's performance just completely sells who this guy is, who he's trying to be, and who we see him as. And it's like this perfect sync of all three of those layers. And I'll also say, first time I watched this, I didn't know how I felt. I think that it's hard to love this movie the first time. I don't think I know anybody who has fully loved it after one or two viewings. I think it is something that ages better. It ages with time, ages well. And even though some elements of it don't age well, I guess, like in a PC way, but what does? But in terms of like everything that's in this movie, it overwhelms you, and it can be hard to sort of be like, I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. Like, come on, Fellini, like there's so much going on here. What do you want? But if you keep watching it, or if you allow yourself to sort of dig into it, then you get a richer experience, a sweeter experience, if you will, the more and more you see it. And the last thing I'll say, costume design, holy cow.
Oh my. Yeah.
Won the Academy Award. It was nominated for a ton of Academy Awards, I think 12. And it did win the Oscar for best costumes. I forget who the costume designer was. Pierre something.
I will look it up right now.
Blanking on the name, but yeah, it was perfect about the costume design is how understated it is. You could see people wearing these clothes today. That's how timeless it is. And you have to like remind yourself that it's 1960, but at the same time, like this movie is such a blessed time capsule of like, you get such a rich sense of what life was like in this time period, what people were like in a real authentic way. And so, yeah, it's just on that merit of getting a sort of slice of the sweet life. I keep saying that. Yeah. You get that with this movie and then some.
Okay. I'm looking at the best costume design, black and white. I don't see it here. Are you sure it was nominated?
Oh yeah. It definitely won the award. I don't think it won any other awards, but it was a film that was very successful. Box office wise, it made a lot of money. It was a big hit with critics. Like I said, won the Palme d'Or. It's kind of funny because in its time, people were so scared of this movie because of what people saw, as I kind of mentioned earlier, but like the sacrilegious nature of it, the blasphemy. It starts with like an image of a statue of Jesus being hauled by technology. And that was something that really rubbed the Catholic Church the wrong way. I believe, I believe Fellini was almost like excommunicated over this movie, but you can see that was a very dated like attitude toward religion that we, of course, as a society, we've changed our views quite a bit on what's acceptable for commentary on religion. And I think we're better for it. We're better for Fellini taking those risks.
I think you're absolutely right. Just to update on the costume design, I figured out what happened. Evidently, by Academy rules, the movie counted as a 1961 release. So I was looking at the wrong ceremony. That costume designer is Piero Gherardi.
Thank you.
Absolutely, yeah. I have two more questions for you. One of them is a little bit arbitrary, but I'm curious. If you had to choose one, pick one vignette out of this movie to keep out of the rest of them.
Oh, so we lose all the others.
We not necessarily lose all the others, but just what's one that you find yourself most drawn to over the years?
Most drawn to? I feel like that's two different questions, because if I had to keep one, it would probably be the Trevi Fountain, because that one is probably the best at being standalone. It manages to, first of all, it's an incredible feat of filmmaking. The fact that they were able to film this and that Anita Ekberg was in that fountain in that cold weather and able to shoot all of those scenes is just incredible, that they pulled this off. And it sums up a lot of the movie's ideas and really Marcello's like character. One that stands out the most, though, I think like the one with the most complete arc would probably be the scene where his father visits.
Yep,
that really is like a movie unto itself. Yeah. So I think that one is really worth keeping.
I was going to say the exact same thing, so that's good to know. And then also for my second question, for someone like me who is maybe having trouble latching on to, what's the phrase I'm looking for? The sort of stalwart ambiguity of it, like not giving any answers very deliberately. What would you recommend that person do to have the right mindset going into this? Because I still feel like there is a third viewing of this movie where it's really going to click for me. Obviously, I can appreciate a lot of it, and especially after this conversation, there's so much that I hadn't considered before. But I still just think there's just one little piece that hasn't clicked in my mind. What would you advise to someone having never seen it before?
It's tough because everybody's different. We all prepare for long movies in different ways. I can only say for me, when I need to be in the right mindset, it depends a lot on the viewing setup. You know, like if I tried to watch this movie on my phone, or if I tried to watch it like on an iPad or something in bed, like I just don't think I would be immersed. I think it sort of requires you to be a little bit less cozy, because you need to be fully alert. You know, like I think this is a decent like couch and TV watch, just because it allows you to focus a little bit better. You can keep up with the subtitles probably a little bit better because they're a little bit bigger. Yeah. And because one thing that's kind of jarring about this movie for a lot of people is the way everything is dubbed. And I think that problem can be exacerbated if you're watching in like a smaller screen, because it's harder and harder to connect with the movie when it feels like the voices aren't syncing up. And so that's something that a TV watch can sort of help mask a little bit. Never seen this on the big screen, so I don't know if that would be the ultimate way, probably, but who knows? I think, though, this is a movie that you can watch alone and get a lot out of it. I just think that you need to sort of turn off the distractions, like turn your phone off. Don't have technology around. See if you can watch it alone, either late at night or, so that the other things, the beckoning things of life don't get in the way. And, make sure you eat well before. I feel like I'm talking like somebody's mom here. It's like, don't forget to eat your dinner. So you don't get distracted by hunger.
Yes, which does happen, especially for long movies like this.
Yeah, I would recommend, for people who are of age, maybe having a nice glass of wine so you can sort of get caught up in the immersive world building of this. Have like an Italian themed event maybe, because I think one of the things that will attract people who haven't seen this before, or maybe they're trying to rewatch it, is to just revel in the entire like Italianness of it and like the wonderful, like how electric and warm this world is. Fellini is so good at creating worlds, and this particular one is one of his best, especially when it comes to just the way he depicts Rome. So I would say those are a few little tips.
I will definitely take those to heart. Yeah, that's a very good idea of sort of trying to, in our own way, sort of replicate sort of the vibe of this movie, sort of the extravagant vibe. I think create sort of a luxurious atmosphere, but also be ready to see the warts in that luxury. I think that's what this movie is very much about. I do have just an abysmal viewing setup, so that could very well be part of it. So I really need to invest in something better. God, I miss theaters, but don't we all? John, there's one last bit of business that we need to take care of. Lately, on the Extra Milestone podcast, we have been not just talking about the classic movies, but also recommending other movies that perhaps were influenced by those classic movies or have a similar vibe, or maybe even came before. I'm very curious.
Putting in the extra and those extra milestones, aren't you?
Yes, we stand by our title every step of the way. John Negroni, I'm curious, what is a movie, or perhaps more than one, because I actually have two, that you would recommend to someone as perhaps a supplemental viewing of La Dolce Vita?
Well, I have two, and I'm going to start with the most obvious, which is a movie we've already mentioned, 8.5.
Yeah.
I think especially if you've never seen it before, then you should absolutely watch it. I think it's the one Fellini film I would, if I was putting a top 10 list of his movies, that at least the ones that I've seen, I haven't seen every single one, but I think those are the two that are in most like battle because they're both so great. Yeah. And I'd say that, it's a wonderful follow-up. So if you could start with this film and then watch 8.5, you'll really get a great encompassing picture of what Fellini's filmmaking was like, and that can open up his filmography to you. So there's a practical reason behind that, but that's pretty obvious. So I'd say one that's a little bit more unexpected is a 2016 film that not enough people watched, and that is Silence, the Martin Scorsese film. And the reason I picked this one is because, first of all, if you were looking at anybody who sort of was the successor of Fellini, I think you can make a really great case for Martin Scorsese, an Italian-American. And he is somebody who really took a lot of lessons from Fellini without outright replicating his body of work. And you can tell Scorsese not worshipped Fellini, but definitely was heavily inspired by Fellini's films, especially this time period, because Scorsese was like growing up as a filmmaker in the aftermath of these groundbreaking works. And while Fellini was still making movies in the 1970s that were very influential on Scorsese. And I think,
and the 60s, Scorsese got started early.
That's true. I'm thinking of like, some of his 70s work and
the
some
good
of his
stuff.
Yeah, sure. Mean Streets, I guess, is probably what first comes to mind. But yeah, I guess for Silence, which is a 2016 film, it might be a little bit of a surprise, but I think that is Scorsese at his most mature. And I think that is him doing something similar with Fellini when it comes to religion and recognizing, I know some people will probably say like Last Temptation of Christ or something, but I think Silence is the one that is Scorsese at his most astute with this subject matter. It's a totally different country. It's Japan, totally different time period, totally different style, but it's a similar experience of watching a filmmaker question his own ideas in a way that is just lavish with cinematography and costume design. And I think after being transported to 1960s Rome, I think it's very much worth being transported to medieval Japan through the lens of Portuguese missionaries. If you haven't seen Silence, it stars Andrew Garfield, Adam Driver, Liam Neeson. It's an incredible cast, an incredible movie. But for some reason, it just sort of got overlooked by a lot of people who thought it was kind of tedious, which some people also say about the Dolce Vita. So I think if you can get into one, you might be able to get into the other.
That is absolutely fascinating. I never would have guessed that in a million years, but now that you bring up all those points, I'm very intrigued. Yeah, I haven't seen Silence since it first came out, but I've been curious to go back. Maybe now is the time. Silence, I imagine, is relatively easy to find. 8.5 is on the Criterion channel, as it should be. Why La Dolce Vita isn't on there, I am not entirely sure, but perhaps someday it will. Yes. I have 2 recommendations as well. The first one, and they're both from the 1960s, actually. The first one is really only has an aesthetic similarity. It's only in the photography that these movies are really connected. They're about very different things from very different filmmakers. But John, have you ever seen Orson Welles' The Trial?
I have not, actually.
It is a movie released in 1962, I believe, starring Anthony Perkins as a man who gets accused of a crime and they don't tell him what the crime is. It's based on the Franz Kafka novel, and it has all these just ludicrous Kafka-esque rabbit holes that the character goes down. Orson Welles plays an advocate in the movie, and it's a really layered story. I'm not entirely sure what it's about. It's been a while since I've seen it, but one thing that I will never forget is the look of this movie. It looks so much like Rome, to the point where I actually think it might have been filmed there. I really should have looked that up, but it just has that exact same feeling where it's all these buildings really close together, these tall buildings, but also it feels like a landscape at the same time. You know what I'm saying? Like, we very much get that same sense of Rome in La Dolce Vita and other movies set in Rome around the same time. And I immediately thought of The Trial both times while seeing this. It is a very visually distinctive movie. And it's Orson Welles, so you know it's going to have some fascinating ideas in it.
That is fascinating, because I've always wanted to watch that. I know a lot of people consider it really great. I think Welles said it was his best movie.
I think so too. He said it was one of the best, at least.
Yeah, and I know Roger Ebert called it a masterpiece at one point. So yeah, it's just a big gap for me. So I'll have to look into that. That's you said that's Anthony Perkins?
Yeah.
All right.
And there's a famous story of Orson Welles and Peter Bogdanovich. I forget if it was right when it was released or at a screening later on, but they were in a theater watching it with a bunch of other people there, and they were dying laughing while everyone else was taking it really seriously as like a dramatic, artistic story. So I think take that for what it's worth, but they view it as something of a comedy, perhaps an ironic comedy. Who knows what the actual meaning behind it is, but I digress. My second recommendation, I'm curious if you've seen this movie, John, from 1966. Have you ever seen John Frankenheimer's Seconds?
No, I haven't seen that.
Oh, fascinating. It is a science fiction movie starring Rock Hudson, about an older man who is completely dissatisfied, completely disenfranchised with his entire life, and goes to this shady corporation that says for a fee, they will fake his death and surgically reconstruct his face to make him into a younger man so he can start a completely new life. It's almost like this.
I've heard of this.
It's almost like this dark, demented witness protection program almost. The reason
I've
I
seen
thought
the
of it,
image where he has like the bandage like wrapped around his face, and it's horrifying.
There are some really horrifying images having to do with the actual surgical procedure itself. The reason I thought of it is because of actually the scene we brought up a few times in La Dolce Vita, that orgy kind of thing near the end. There's kind of a similar scene in Seconds involving grape stomping, weirdly enough. Like, there's this really energetic grape stomping party with a bunch of young naked people, and then there's this old guy who looks like a young guy and is just has has no idea what's going on and has fallen down this rabbit hole. It really reminded me of that same story of just trying to reckon with your own life and reflecting on it and realizing, is it worth it? Is anything worth it? What is even our purpose here? And it's really stylish. It's really gripping. It's really intense. And I really, really like it. I only just got to see it recently. It was expiring off the Criterion channel, but it's elsewhere. It's easy to find.
I'm always down to watch something with Rock Hudson. Especially after watching Hollywood, the Netflix series, which kind of is like a alternative reality to what his career would have been like if he had been able to be out as a gay actor, especially because that was, his heyday really was like the 40s and 50s. So I don't know too much about his filmography in the 60s.
Admittedly, it doesn't go much beyond seconds, but regardless, it's a really fantastic one. I haven't actually seen that series on Netflix, but I've been meaning to check that out.
I don't know if you would like it, but I think you should definitely try it out.
I don't know.
It's something else.
My taste is very strange, John. There's no predicting it.
I gave up trying a long time ago.
As well you should have. And with that, I believe that is our show. John, thank you so much for coming on to talk La Dolce Vita. I know you were looking forward to it, and I could tell that you had a lot to say, and I'm glad you said it because it was all fascinating.
Thank you, Sam, for making it happen. And I have to apologize to Nino Rota for not mentioning the music enough in this because it's so perfect.
It really is. Yeah. It's not in your face, but when it's there, it really makes an impact.
Mostly diegetic too, if I recall. So
yeah, I think so too. There's a lot of like jazz bands and things of that nature.
Oh, we got to stop her. We're going to keep talking for another hour.
We're going to keep talking about it. Yes.